On a Montana plain, scientists discovered the grave of a baby nearly 12,800 years old. They analyzed the chemical composition of the baby's bones to determine what the mother had eaten during pregnancy. The results stunned the research team. 96% of the protein in the mother's body came from a single animal. The mammoth, a baby who never lived to grow up, whose bones still revealed, 12,800 years later, that its mother's survival depended heavily on one enormous, now extinct animal. So the real question isn't simply, what did people eat before farming? The real question is, how did these people survive a life this dangerous? Let's find out. For decades, archaeologists have been divided into two camps. One group argued that early Americans were generalists, people who ate whatever they could find, small animals, plants, and anything else that was available. The other group argued that these people were specialists, highly focused hunters who followed enormous herbivores like mammoths, mastodons, and giant ground sloths. A major study published in 2026 compared archaeological sites stretching from Alaska all the way to South America, and the evidence strongly supports the specialist camp. At these sites, more than 99% of the edible animal biomass came from megafauna. Small animals, very little. Evidence of plant processing, almost non-existent. And these people weren't settling down in one place. They were extremely mobile. Similar stone tool technologies appear across enormous distances from California to Florida, and even farther south into South America. That suggests something remarkable. A surprisingly consistent survival strategy spread across the continent. But why hunt giant animals? At first, the strategy seems strange. Why ignore smaller, easier prey, and take the enormous risk of hunting animals that could weigh several tons? The answer comes down to something surprisingly simple: energy economics. A single mammoth could provide enormous amounts of meat and fat, enough to support an entire group for an extended period of time, and the way these animals were processed provides another clue. At some sites, people didn't always completely break open the bones to extract every bit of marrow. That suggests food may sometimes have been abundant enough that they didn't need to recover every last calorie. Put simply, when one enormous, high-fat animal can provide an incredible amount of food, chasing dozens of smaller animals may simply not be worth the time and energy. But this strategy had a hidden weakness, because when those giant animals began disappearing, the entire food system was about to collapse. Roughly 12,800 years ago, megafauna across North America began disappearing rapidly. Mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, they vanished. But this is where the story gets interesting. At Monte Verde in Chile, outside North America, but dating to roughly the same broad era, archaeologists found fossilized human feces, known as coprolites, containing traces of dozens of plant species. The site also preserves evidence of wood and hide shelters, and at Paisley Caves and Conley Caves in Oregon, researchers found a similar story. Coprolites and hearth deposits contained evidence of foods including cattail, goosefoot, wild rice grass, saltbush, and seeds from the sunflower family. The message is clear. As megafauna disappeared, people adapted quickly. They increasingly turned towards smaller animals, such as bison, while also relying on a much more diverse, region-specific plant diet. This is the point where food traditions across the continent began to become increasingly regional, what archaeologists describe as regional diversification. Over the following thousands of years, there was no longer any single thing we could call an American diet. Instead, different environments produced completely different food systems. Along the Pacific coast, people relied heavily on salmon and shellfish. In the Great Basin, diets included seeds, roots, and small game, exactly the kind of foods reflected in evidence from places like Paisley Caves. On the Great Plains, bison became central to survival, and in desert regions, people learned how to process plants that were difficult to eat when raw. Take acorns, for example. People could soak them in water to remove bitter tannins, a process that could sometimes take days. In other words, what began as a single high-risk specialist strategy gradually transformed into hundreds of local food systems. each one finely tuned to its environment. And now comes the twist that many people don't know. Thousands of years later, when farming began spreading through these regions, and people became increasingly dependent on one or two staple crops, skeletal remains reveal a striking pattern. Average height decreased, dental problems increased, and certain diseases became more common. The reason is relatively simple. Despite all the dangers of hunter-gatherer life, their diets were often naturally diverse. When that diversity was replaced by a narrower, grain-heavy diet, food security increased in the long term, but individual health did not necessarily improve. Farming allowed human populations to grow much larger, but that didn't necessarily mean that life became healthier for every individual. So the next time you see a picture of a mammoth, remember this. There was once an entire way of life, the survival strategy of some of the first people in the Americas, that depended heavily on enormous animals like these. And when those animals disappeared, humans had to reinvent the way they survived. If you found this video interesting, tell me in the comments, should the next video be, how did farming actually make humans sicker? Like, share, and subscribe. I'll see you in the next video.